Okay. Happy to see you here for the third and final session with Professor Sarna. I'd like to invite all of you, if you're around here Shavuot, you're welcome to come. We're going to have English lectures here right in this room. So we'll be starting Shavuot at 11:30 with Aviva Zorenberg. After that, Professor Richie Cohen from Hebrew U. And we'll end the night with Dr. Daniel Gordis. So you're all invited to come here. Make sure you come early if you want to make sure you get a seat. We'll be happy to see you. Please make sure your phones are silenced. Now check again. And silence again. Professor Sarna.
You're still waiting for someone?
All right. Well, good evening. It's nice to be back. And I heard some of you came last week. What can I say? Mr. Trump trumped their lecture. But you got exercise. All right. Those who were here 2 weeks ago, what we did was trace the story of pilgrims and tourists who came from America to the land of Israel in the 19th century. And I talked a lot about steam, which, of course, improved the comfort and the reliability and the speed of travel. And we talked about Mark Twain's tour to Europe and the Middle East, and then Ulysses S. Grant's tour around the world, including here in the land of Israel. Those of you who read Makor Rishon saw that they also quoted Grant's tour. And these would have been all unthinkable prior to the advent of global steam travel. And so by the end of the 19th century, Holy Land travel was already a burgeoning industry. And what I want to do this evening is really talk about early Zionism in America from the late 19th century through World War I. We'll spend quite a bit of time on Louis Brandeis. I said, I think the first lecture, it's in my contract, I have to mention Brandeis in each lecture. But Brandeis is really important. Now, I'm obviously not suggesting a direct causal relationship, a new theory relating steam to Zionism, and actually nationalism, in Brandeis's case, especially Irish nationalism, is much more important. But it is worth remembering that the idea of Jewish restoration to the land of Israel gained renewed interest, obviously, once people visited the land of Israel, and once it was possible to envisage how people would come here en masse. Those of you who were at the first lecture may remember we talked about how Newport Jews thought they'd come in the midst of a thunderstorm on a cloud, and how people thought, you know, there'd be an eagle and you'd fly. How many of you would have come on the wings of eagles? So in other words, in even the early 19th century, there's an assumption that Shivat Zion, that return to Zion, is supernatural, something that will happen in a supernatural way. Now, after you have steamships that can cross the ocean, it's perfectly obvious how restoration can be effected in perfectly natural ways. Now, early American Jewish discussions concerning Jewish return to Zion in a very practical way, and return to Zion is different than interest in Zion or philanthropy towards Zion. People personally returning to Eretz Yisrael that really dates to the 1870s. That's really when we begin hearing Jews, especially, not exclusively, but especially young Jews. Young Jews are always rebellious, and this rebellion was of Jews in their teens and their 20s and their 30s, and they begin to talk about the restoration of our people to the land of our inheritance. That's part of a much broader effort to promote and shape what I've called elsewhere, you can find it on the web, the late 19th century, excuse me, American Jewish awakening. Remember that the 1870s see a surprising resurgence of anti-Semitism. It first occurs in Germany, and that's really where the word anti-Semitism was invented. Doesn't mean before then everybody loved Jews, and then thank God we have a word. But actually, earlier Jews just called it rishus, wickedness, evil, and so on. The Yiddish term, the word anti-Semitism, is quite explicitly invented by a man named Wilhelm Marr. I guess everybody's got to be remembered for inventing something. And he invents this term because, of course, it's scientific. It's not old-fashioned Jew hatred. Now it's based on good science of race. And that's the word anti-Semitism. Excuse me. And it very quickly moves from Germany to the United States. And we see it quite clearly in a few incidents. The best known is in 1877. If you go to the very last page of the handout, you'll see a cartoon. And that cartoon is based on this. In 1877, the Jewish banker Joseph Seligman traveled to the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga, very fancy hotel, and he was turned away at the door, a kind of public shaming of a man who was a good friend of Ulysses S. Grant, one of the great bankers of the time. He'd actually been invited and turned the job down. He'd been invited to be Secretary of the Treasury. He was nervous about a Jew taking on that kind of position. But, he's turned away. Judge Henry Hilton, who was the new, you may have heard the word Hilton, that's where it came from, he was the new owner of the Grand Union, and he gave strict instructions. No Israelite shall be permitted in future to stop at this hotel. There was a great deal of discussion about, of course, the banker Seligman looked absolutely nothing like this, but it shows you how there's a kind of image of the Jew that emerges, and of course, with this very interesting comment, how you knowed I wasn't a Christian, said in a deep dialect, a reminder, it's a good reminder, that for a long period of time it was assumed, there are people in this room who remember that assumption, that you looked at someone, you listened to someone, you knew that they were Jewish, what we might call Jewish radar. Extremely interesting that in one generation, this generation, that idea has completely disappeared. It's not our subject, but due to intermarriage and adoptions, and to some extent the diversity of Jews from other countries besides Central and Eastern Europe, the very idea is unknown to most of my students. But in this case, that's the point of the joke. In any case, in the 1870s is one of those moments when the condition of Jews in America gets worse and not better. Jews had assumed, oh, things are getting better and better, we're getting more and more accepted, we'll be good reformed Jews and be like everybody else. And then to their astonishment, they face, in the late 19th century, prejudice that they never expected. They're declared unwelcome first at hotels and then at Coney Island, and then social anti-Semitism, as it was called, becomes commonplace. It wasn't violent, but it was social anti-Semitism, which is going to grow and grow and grow up to World War II. Yes, many universities are going to have quotas. Many jobs are going to be closed to Jews. Whole industries, a company like Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, would tell Jews that they weren't comfortable. They weren't comfortable there. And you even had in 1879 an organization with the memorable title, the American Society for the Suppression of the Jews. And in case you wanted to join that society, you had to pledge that you wouldn't elect Jews to public office, wouldn't attend theater where Jewish composers wrote the music or Jewish actors performed. You wouldn't buy or read books by Jewish authors. That would make your library very small. You wouldn't ride on Jewish-owned railroads. You wouldn't do business with Jewish-owned insurance companies. Of course, a historian observes that that means the number of Jews and the position of Jews in America is growing, and people were aware of it. On the other hand, from the point of view of the Jewish community, although it wasn't a big organization, the very existence of such an organization in America was utterly shocking. And it's no accident for those who know black history that this is the period of Jim Crow. That's when Jim Crow legislation, the rise of Jim Crow takes place in this very same period. And in a way, the two are linked. As race becomes more and more important in America, Jews who were viewed as being a distinctive, inferior race, and blacks who were seen as being an even more inferior race, faced terrible prejudice. I'm not suggesting it was as bad for Jews as for blacks throughout the South. Of course, blacks are Jim Crow legislation means that blacks can't use the same bathrooms and can't sit on the same bus or the same places, can't even use the same water fountains. But just as their status declines enormously from what it had been, say, in the 1860s after the Civil War ends, and they face a great decline in status, so Jews see their status decline, and there's a lot of unsettling of the Jewish community in the following years because, of course, mass immigration begins. We usually date that to 1881. It doesn't mean there weren't East European Jews before. There were. But 1881 sees famous pogroms, what are called in Hebrew, euphemistically, Sufot Banegev, because the newspapers weren't allowed to publish that there had been pogroms, so suddenly they had reports of storms in the Negev, and people understood what was going on. But those pogroms lead to immigration, and that unsettles American-born Jews, and likewise leads some of them to think about Zion in new ways. And the proof of all of this is a woman whose name many of you will know, and that name is Emma Lazarus. Anybody know why we know Emma Lazarus? Right, give me your tired, you're poor. She's a poet, and her famous poem, unless the current administration removes it, is I don't make political comments. There is in a plaque on the Statue of Liberty, the new Colossus. It was originally composed to raise funds for that pedestal. She's born of a very aristocratic Jewish family, kind of mixed Sephardic, Ashkenazic heritage. She emerges at a very young age as a sensitive poet. She publishes her first book of poetry at the age of 17. But the truth is, if you look at that book of poetry, there's nothing Jewish about it. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's a poem about Christmas. She didn't have many ties to the Jewish community, but she is transformed by anti-Semitism and then Jewish immigration from persecuted Jews fleeing from Russia in the wake of the assassination of Alexander II and those pogroms, and she suddenly emerges as a staunch defender of Jewish rights, and she's one of these awakened Jews, and this is the point, she becomes deeply interested in the idea of what they called, the word Zionism hadn't been invented, a national Jewish movement aimed at the establishment of a free Jewish state. And in Jewish circles, they didn't look at her poem, The New Colossus. Instead, they looked at this poem, which you have on your sheet, The Banner of the Jew. And I talk about an awakening. How does she begin? Wake, Israel, wake. I'm not going to go line by line, but it recalled the Maccabean. Now, not so much attention had been paid to the Maccabees in the 19th century. Indeed, Hanukkah was not a big holiday in America in the 19th century. The gift-giving holiday was Purim, not Hanukkah. There are good reasons why Jews in the late 19th century begin to look at Hanukkah and try and revitalize it. It's not accident that Christmas becomes a national holiday in that period, but the sense of looking at the Maccabees, after all, the Maccabees are nationalists. They want to stage an awakening. They're fighting assimilation. The fact that she turns back to the Maccabees is deeply significant. And the key is the very last paragraph on this page. It's not the last stanza of the poem, but it's the stanza that everybody quoted, and is still the best-known stanza. And if you go online, you'll see some people drop the last stanza. Oh, deem not dead that martial fire. Say not the mystic flame is spent. With Moses' law and David's lyre, your ancient strength remains unbent. Let but an Ezra rise. Oh, sorry. Of course, I forgot you are filming this. I'm sorry. All right. Let but an Israel rise anew. I'm sorry. Let but an Ezra rise anew to lift the banner of the Jew. And that wasn't just hyperbole, because we begin to see the banner of the Jew. The blue and white flag, I've argued, actually has its origin in Boston. That's the first time one sees it. Those of you interested can read a recent piece of mine. You'll also find it online or shoot me an email. But even if you don't agree with that, we begin to see the banner of the Jew, which is essentially the flag of Zion. There are a variety of different designs, but it will eventually be the progenitor of the flag of Israel. And America plays a huge role, it turns out, in the design and the acceptance of that flag. The European flags looked a little different in many places. You'll see there that in the 1924 World's Fair, the flag of Zion flies, and we have a marvelous picture that I found in the Library of Congress, and you would never know that that's not the flag of Israel. It looks exactly like it. So if you're interested, you can see it. But this notion of the banner of the Jew, that's a flag. That means Jews are a people. They're a nation. Just like you had the Irish flag and other peoples. And that's really what we're beginning to see. And indeed, she refers here to Jerusalem, and she has become very taken with the idea of Jewish restoration, and she, in addition to her poem, writes a remarkable group of erudite essays. You can read them in the American Hebrew, or you can see her book very much reprinted, called An Epistle to the Hebrews, which calls for a deepening and quickening of the sources of Jewish enthusiasm in response to the storm center in our history that Jews are passing through. There was a sense. This is an important moment, lots of changes taking place, and new ideas about Zion are related to that. There's also a big shift, whereas the earlier 19th century Jews had really focused on Judaism as a religion. That, of course, is at the core of Reform Judaism. We see Judaism as a religion, said they. These rebellious young Jews reverse that and begin discovering anew the idea of Jewish peoplehood. If you're going to discriminate against us as a people, we are going to celebrate ourselves as a people, and you begin to see a lot of idea long before Herzl, or at least a few years before Herzl, decade. You begin to see ideas that we associate with the Zionist movement. So Emma Lazarus starts learning Hebrew, talks about peoplehood and unity and discipline and organization. Now, she's not alone. Obviously, if we were studying the whole world, there's George Eliot and Lawrence Oliphant and Leon Pinsker, but all of them, and it's worth knowing that America is part of that, you begin to hear talk of the recolonization of Palestine. And I remind you, I know it's not politically correct today, but in all of the writing about Palestine that we saw, whether it's Mark Twain or Grant, this was a kind of empty land, and the sense was, why not allow Jews, especially persecuted Jews, and they had in mind, especially, as we'll see, Jews from Eastern Europe, to go there and be revitalized. And it's interesting to see what Emma Lazarus says. She uses religious language, the language of conversion, in talking about Zion. She writes, Under my own eyes, I have seen equally rapid and thorough conversions to the same doctrine in the minds of mature and thoughtful men, men of prudence and of earnest purpose, little apt to be swayed by the chance enthusiasm of a popular agitation. It has taken profound root and in some cases overturned the theories and intellectual habits of a lifetime. In other words, people abandoned past beliefs which were so opposed to Jewish nationalism, and now at the end of the last quarter or so of the 19th century are making a change in her case in beginning of the 1880s. Even well-known rabbis today, it's not much talked about, but Sabato Moraeus, founder of the Jewish Theological Seminary, important Sephardic rabbi, Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, not much interested in return to Zion. Even in Europe, although that too is later, not much talked about. The great Orthodox leader Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, you won't find much interest in Zion in Hirsch. But now you begin to see real change, some on the part of young Jews, especially in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, but also significant rabbis. So it's worth remembering, the great Reform rabbi, Gustav Gottheil, who was the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, almost the Jewish archbishop, becomes interested in Zion, and his son, Richard, is going to be a leading figure in the American Zionist movement. Or another very, very famous Reform rabbi who does literally 180-degree change is Bernard Felsenthal of Chicago, who becomes very strongly supportive of Zionism, in part because he's worried that unless there is such a movement, Jews will assimilate out of existence. And in his late years, he repudiates some of his earlier views. And then we have others. I'm not going to go person by person, but you begin to see people urging American Jews who had the money to buy land in Palestine. There's an organization, Shavei Zion, Return to Zion, and it sold. There's a big discussion about whether, if you find one in the attic, a piece of paper saying you bought an acre in Jerusalem, whether that's worth anything or not, you'll have to get a good lawyer, that's for sure. But the very fact that people were buying such things is very telling. And of course, among those who come to America, in addition to all those I've mentioned, you have East European Jews who had been involved in Zionism in Europe. They'd been Chovevei Zion, they'd been lovers of Zion. Now they're forced to leave as refugees. They don't go to Zion. Actually, not too many people. More than 80% of all those who leave Russia come to the United States. A much smaller percentage go to Eretz Yisrael, and many of those who go to Eretz Yisrael don't last all that long there. Some of them go on to America for obvious reasons. It was extremely difficult. But if you came to America, you might still come with dreams of returning to Zion, and some of the immigrants did, and certainly we see vast new emphasis on Jewish peoplehood. And if you do one of those Google searches that tells you terms, you'll see that the term Jewish race rises And that term will be a common term until it collapses in the 1930s. Yes, it would have been, I don't know if anybody here would still know that term, but if we had been here at that time and you had done something good, we would say you are a credit to your race. When I have students, Brandeis, I suggest they not say that to their roommate, and for obvious reasons, race, which is pseudoscience, collapses the term in the 30s, and that's when we see new words like a word you may think has been around forever, but it's not. Jewish peoplehood is invented and heavily used by Mordechai Kaplan and others after race collapses as a term, and Kaplan says the new word. He doesn't use it in his first book. But in any case, we see a big change. Poor Emma Lazarus doesn't see it because she died Nebuch of Hodgkin's disease at the age of 38, but her writing lives on and on and on, and actually is very influential later on Louis Brandeis. There are a bunch of Louis Brandeis letters where he recommends that they send the epistles of Emma Lazarus to so-and-so and so-and-so, and the Zionist movement kept her writings in print for decades and decades. Now, in addition to the Jews who become interested in this period in return to Zion, we see Christians who become interested as well, and that's a good thing, because had the Christians been very opposed, the Jews might have viewed it differently. The reason Christians become interested, and some are today, nothing has changed in that regard, is a new idea among Protestants that the Jewish return to Zion is literally a precondition to the second coming of their Messiah. Whereas earlier you had supersessionist thought. Christians have replaced Jews. Jews aren't going anywhere. Now, as Protestant, there's a reason it's Protestants. They began reading the Bible on their own. They read the Bible. They didn't find any evidence of supersession. It says Jews are going to return. Last time, if you don't believe it, read the prophets. And they said, wow, Jews are going to return, and indeed that is a precondition for the second coming. And then you have new theological developments in what's called dispensationalism, which argues that Christians will rapture. They will go up and watch this great drama of the Jews returning, and then there'll be battles, and they believe Jews would convert at that time, but not before. The most important figure in this dispensationalist thought is a man named the Reverend William E. Blackstone. And I gave you, he himself visited the land of Israel in 1888. He called it the Holy Land. And he then composes an absolutely remarkable memorial, as it's called. The term memorial doesn't mean it's dead. That's a fancy term for a memorial, a statement of facts, a petition. It's not like the Lincoln Memorial. It's rather like a statement of facts. And notice how it begins. You've got it here on your second page. What shall be done for the Russian Jews is the way it begins. And he has come to the conclusion already in 1891, a conclusion that the bulk of American Jews are not going to come to until after the Kishinev pogrom of 1903. And the conclusion is Jews have to leave Russia. There's a lot of reporting in America on the mistreatment of Jews and the conditions of Jews and the pogroms. He's concluded they've got to get out. Where shall 2 million of such poor people go? Europe is crowded and has no room for more peasant population. Actually, the Jews were not really peasants in a technical term, but they were very poor, and that's what he meant. Shall they come to America? This will be a tremendous expense and require years. And it's worth remembering. We often don't. And it's not a popular subject. But the truth is, many of the Christians who supported Zionism did so because they'd much rather that the Jews go to Zion than come to America. If you read the papers of a man who's very famous, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, also supports Zion. But he supports Zion, and at the same time, he's an ardent restrictionist. From his perspective, that's not contradictory at all. He's a restrictionist because he thinks it will be bad for America. He supports Zion because he's a liberal person, doesn't want them to die, let them go somewhere else. And that's the idea, and he said so. Why not give Palestine back to them again? And then he talks about his view, according to God's distribution of nations, it is their home, an inalienable possession from which they were expelled by force. Under their cultivation, it was a remarkably fruitful land, sustaining millions of Israelites who industrially tilled its hillsides and valleys. They were agriculturalists and producers, as well as a nation of great commercial importance, the center of civilization and religion. And you can see many ideas we might imagine originated with the Zionist movement, or I don't know, with Tzipi Hotovely, but actually they're here long before articulated by a Christian. And note also, I won't read it all, but note the links. This is within a nationalist context. If we can give Bulgaria to the Bulgarians and Serbia, what we call Serbia, to the Serbians, why not Palestine to the Jews? Other provinces, as he says, were wrested from the Turks and given to their natural owners. Does not Palestine as rightfully belong to the Jews? And he talks about maybe compensating Turkey, which Herzl also believed in. And we believe at the bottom this is an appropriate time for all nations, and especially the Christian nations of Europe, to show kindness to Israel. 1 million of exiles, by their terrible suffering, are piteously appealing to our sympathy, justice, and humanity. Let us now restore them to the land of which they were so cruelly despoiled by our Roman ancestors. And this remarkable petition is signed by 431, I don't know if there's a gematria, 431, but it's signed by 431 prominent citizens, and very prominent: John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, William McKinley, who shortly will become president of the United States, and all sorts of other political leaders. And it is presented to President Benjamin Harrison in 1891. It's covered from one end of the country to the other in newspapers. Now, from a Jewish point of view, there was a big debate. And the debate was, do we work with this guy? On the one hand, it's fabulous what he says. He loves Jews, will return to Zion. He puts it in a nationalist context, and so on. On the other hand, the people who knew who Blackstone was, not all the Zionists did, but the folks in Chicago certainly knew, said, well, we're going to work with a missionary who believes he really wants to bring the second coming and thinks that when Jesus comes, there'll be big battles, and you know where the Jews who don't convert are going to end up in those dramas. And that was really the debate, and it hasn't changed from that day until this day. It's the very same debate between those people who say, how do you work with evangelicals who have the ultimate goal of converting Jews? That's one view. And the other says, well, politics is the art of the possible. We need allies. And besides, when the Messiah comes, we'll just ask him, is it your first visit or your second visit? And then there'll be no doubt. And until then, why not work together? That battle has gone on now, do the math, almost 140 years. And it's not resolved. It's probably not resolvable. But I can tell you that Louis Brandeis thought that this petition was fabulous. And we know that because really in 1917, meaning 30 years later, when Blackstone was an old man, he arranges for an updated version to be prepared. Blackstone lived a long life. He was still alive. And the reason, Brandeis was a very clever man. Brandeis made sure that the second time around, it would be endorsed by the Presbyterian Church. They don't much admit it today. They're not very pro-Israel today. But Brandeis had a good reason for wanting it to be endorsed by the Presbyterian Church. Anybody know what the reason was? Who was a famous Presbyterian in 1917? Woodrow Wilson, who was the President of the United States. And Brandeis had the idea that this would help in getting Wilson to endorse the Balfour Declaration. So we're bringing this just up to a centennial of the Balfour Declaration. And, of course, Wilson does endorse the Balfour Declaration. He doesn't say, I received the Blackstone petition, saw Presbyterians, signed it, and made up my mind. So that allows scholars to debate whether it had an impact. It didn't have an impact, and there is such a debate. But so much we know, it didn't do any harm because Wilson did sign on to the Balfour Declaration. But what I wanted you to see is already back in the 1880s, the subject, and 90s, the subject of Jewish restoration is being spoken about in Jewish circles and also in Christian circles in a way that certainly had not been the case 30 years earlier. Now, we also know that Zionism, the word doesn't exist yet, but return to Zion is becoming more and more significant in the American Jewish mind because we see the idea criticized. And as a historian, I know that when people start criticizing and getting excited about it, that means they think it's real. And we know that because the reform movement, and again, you see this the reform movement begins and puts out two resolutions. One is very well known, one is almost unknown, against this new development. They didn't put out a resolution against Hasidism. They didn't put out a resolution against Karaism. So the fact that there is a resolution proves in many ways that they are nervous about these new and, to their mind, dangerous currents in Jewish life. And as I mentioned, even within Reform Judaism, where some Reform rabbis, Gottheil, Felsenthal, and others, are moving and changing their views. In 1885, the so-called Pittsburgh Platform is put together by Reform rabbis, enormously important in defining the Reform movement, so important that there are actually going to be synagogues or temples that are going to put the Pittsburgh Platform on the wall. You want to be a member, you got to subscribe to all of these to all of these planks of the platform. And one of those planks reads, you have it here, "We recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. We consider ourselves no longer a nation," the very opposite of Emma Lazarus, "but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state." This is later repudiated by the Reform movement. Some don't accept it at the time. And the Columbus Platform is going to overturn this in 1937. But I wanted you to see what in many ways is a much more explicit attack, and this time the word Zionism is there. And this shows us how those ideas are spreading. Excuse me. Because you never would have put such a resolution out unless you were nervous. Nobody writes, as I said, a resolution unless they are. Sorry. "We are opposed to political Zionism. The Jews are not a nation, but a religious community. Zion has a precious possession of the past, the early home of our faith, where prophets uttered their world-subduing thoughts, and our psalmists sang their world-enchanting hymns. As such, it is a holy memory, but it is not our hope of the future." And then you have those famous words, "America is our Zion." And that becomes so important. We're in Erev Shavuos, that there is a famous synagogue in San Francisco. It's not Emmanuel, it's the other one, that actually still has a window. And Moses descends not into Palestine, but he descends into America. That's our Zion. Those of you who have my American Judaism, I have a picture of it in there. "Here in the home of religious liberty, we have aided in founding this new Zion, the fruition of the beginning laid in the old. The mission of Judaism is spiritual, not political. Its aim is not to establish a state, but to spread the truths of religion and humanity throughout the world." This is actually a much stronger, almost point-by-point response to political Zionism. It's one of the strongest of those statements, and as I say, it comes out from the union of American Hebrew congregations, what today is the Union of Reform Judaism, meaning that it comes from lay people. But even then, there were plenty of dissenters. But it did pass and pass strongly. Some of the leading, I just want to mention that, because it's not much remembered here, that there were very important early Reform Zionists who disagreed. Famous ones are Stephen Wise and Abba Hillel Silver, lesser known the brothers Max and Jacob Raisin, and the number of converts to Zionism is actually going to increase year by year. I mean, a very famous example is Rabbi Judah Magnus, who's going to come and be the president of the Hebrew University here, and actually, interestingly, changes his name. That's a real conversion, when people change their name. If you look when he's admitted to Hebrew Union College, and he writes there, it's J. Leon Magnus. And as part of his conversion to Zionism, he actually, like people who come to Israel, take on a new Hebrew name. He becomes Judah Leib, Yehuda Leib Magnus. So a famous example, and there are many others. Some are motivated by persecution and feel we need the Zionist movement to find a place for Jews, and others are motivated by the excitement of the movement or the fear that without Zionism, maybe Jews would assimilate out of existence. Now, very hard to know how many Zionists there are in America prior to World War I. What we do know is how many people were card-carrying Zionists. That we have a list. But that doesn't mean that's the total number of Zionists. There are all sorts of supporters of things who are not card carriers. There are between 15 and 20,000 card-carrying Zionists, meaning they're members of some Zionist organization. Considering that there are at least 2.5 million Jews in America, nothing. 15,000, 20,000, 2.5 million Jews, it was still a small, rather noisy, but small movement. Socialism is a much more significant movement than Zionism. And that brings us to Louis Brandeis, because really it's under Brandeis that the Zionist movement in America is transformed, and it's really Brandeis's conversion to Zionism that is tremendously important. And it's not just a historical matter. You can't understand American Zionism. You can't even understand why some American Jews today feel, Zionism is different than we thought it would be, unless you understand the Zionism of Louis Brandeis and why it was so extraordinary and exciting to American Jews. Now, Brandeis was born back in 1856, had practically nothing much to do with Jews for much of his early decades. He was much closer to his relative, brother-in-law, Felix Adler, who was the head of the ethical culture movement, and lots of people didn't think Louis Brandeis identified Jewishly at all. If you want proof of that, go to the old Jewish encyclopedia, now online, look up Louis Brandeis. You'd think a prominent Jew, leading lawyer, not yet Supreme Court justice by then, you'd think he'd be there. He's not. And that wasn't accident, although, he'd founded Savings Bank Life Insurance and was known in America as the people's attorney. A lot of them thought he's not interested in things Jewish. I'm not sure he still identifies, said they, We're not going to put him in the Jewish Encyclopedia or in the early years of the American Jewish Yearbook, where if you have an old copy, they listed every famous Jew they could find, but not him. Now, there is an enormous literature that seeks to explain Louis Brandeis' midlife conversion to Zionism. There are a lot of people who have midlife crises, doesn't usually lead them in that direction. Lots of people take credit for it. Whenever you see a huge literature like that, it means we're not really sure. Most conversions are hard to explain. If you've ever known somebody who underwent a conversion, it's inscrutable, and that's the case with Brandeis as well. But what is important for our purposes and is truly central to our story is Brandeis's agreement on August the 30th, 1914. That's just weeks. Remember, World War I, it's easy to remember. It starts on Tisha B'Av. And just a few weeks later, Louis Brandeis agrees to be chairman of, had a very long and grand name for something that was very small, Provisional Executive Committee for General Zionist Affairs. But that's essentially, he's the head of American Zionism. Once World War I broke out, they had to break ties with the Zionist center in Germany. Germany's on the other side. America hasn't entered the war yet, but they certainly don't want ties to Germany, and Brandeis becomes head of American Zionism. And he knew, I think, two great truths, which anybody who followed world events as closely as he did certainly understood. And that's crucial. Number one, and this has been forgotten because we only talk about World War II. It's good to remember at its centennial World War I. World War I posed an unprecedented crisis for hundreds of thousands of Jews engulfed in the fighting, and especially those who lived, as many, many Jews did, in the border territories. That's where Jews had to live, and the Shtetl actually are basically going to be wiped out in World War I. So that's the first truth that he knew. This was a moment of existential danger to hundreds of thousands of Jews in Europe. Some of them had relatives in America who, of course, were very guilty because they all said, oh, maybe if I'd worked harder and made more money, I would have been able to bring my wife and children over and they wouldn't be caught in war. So there was terrible angst in East European circles. Anyway, that's one truth, the crisis of World War I. The second thing that Brandeis knew is that owing to the war and to growing anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, most of those Jews in Eastern Europe, so desperate to get out, would not be able to immigrate to America. Indeed, he and a lot of people understood that the era of massive Jewish immigration to the United States was ending. I will say in parentheses, you needn't accept this, I annoy some of the scholars here because they like to point to the Hebron riots as central and to various other dates. And I was saying, no, that's not right at all. The key date is actually when America closes its gate in 1924. Because when America closes its gate, you've got to find some other place for all of those Jews who want to get out. Or to put it differently, do a thought experiment. If America had said, we agree with those Reformed Jews, we are the new Zion, all Jews are welcome to come and settle in the United States of America, I assure you, the history of Zionism and of the land of Israel would be entirely different. But that didn't happen. And that's why, in many ways, you needed a Zion, because it welcomes you even when it's unpopular elsewhere. But the fact that America closes its doors is absolutely crucial. And Brandeis, although it's 10 years earlier, you didn't have to be clairvoyant to know that was coming. There's plenty of anti-immigrant sentiment building up. It's rather similar in some ways to the period we're in now in the United States with anti-immigrant sentiment building. It's easier to understand. So those are the two things that Brandeis knew. And Brandeis's leadership transformed Zionism in America. Instead of being a narrow group of believers, now it's an effective political force because this man knew politics intimately. He's famously talked about men, money. Today that's politically incorrect, but he said men, money, discipline, and he brings vast efficiency. Indeed, he even installed a time clock. They were all shocked in the Zionist headquarters. But it's more than that. He personally, like Herzl, had mystique and charm and prestige and sincerity and passion, and lots of people wanted to be part of a movement that the great Louis Brandeis led. It's hard to underestimate the significance. We have description. He was very tall and handsome. He walked into, and of course he was Central European, he walked into the room, everybody got up. He talked, they shut up and listened, and so on. And the fact that a man who was so well known in America as a lawyer, and then later in 1916, he's going to become the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. The man of that stature came to Zionism, really brought it vast legitimacy and significance, and it actually brought all sorts of other people to Zionism. And of course, Brandeis was not a religious Jew. He scarcely didn't belong to a synagogue, scarcely ever attended synagogue, and certainly was not knowledgeable Jewishly, although he reads a great deal after he converts to Zionism. But we see all sorts of others who are removed from Jewish life who find that Zionism is now going to give them a way to synthesize their progressive ideals. That's what Brandeis was. He was an American progressive with their rather latent Jewish attachments. And in a way, it becomes the religion of these kinds of Jews who are disaffected from Judaism but get very excited by this mission. We're going to build what they call a model state in the Holy Land. And note what Brandeis talks about. Free from the economic wrongs, the social injustices, the greed of modern-day industrialism. It's a kind of utopia, it seems to me, that we see in Brandeis. And I have to say, he does view Zion in rather utopian terms and really continues to do so. There's a great letter from Brandeis to Henrietta Zold in the 30s. Brandeis has read, I'm sorry to shock you, they found a thief in the land of Israel, a Jewish thief. Brandeis is shocked and appalled and writes a letter to Henrietta Zold. I've got to imagine what ran through her mind. This genius, and yet he has such a naive view. He also writes in the 30s, a little after our time, the 30s is the middle of the Great Depression. Palestine is the only place in the world where everyone is truly happy. Prozac nation, yeah. It really astonishing, astonishing that the man had such ideas, but nevertheless, it reminds us of the utopia in the mind of Zionists. And even though Brandeis only remains, it's not our subject, he remains 7 years, 14 to 21, as head of the Zionist movement, crucial period, World War I and its aftermath. But we now know more than we once did that even after he has a famous battle with Chaim Weitzman and steps back, he continues to work behind the scenes. What Brandeis does, he really does three things, and then I want to read his program with you. First of all, he legitimates Zionism. If Louis Brandeis can be a Zionist, you can't talk about dual loyalty. After all, Woodrow Wilson appointed him to the Supreme Court. If President Wilson doesn't think there's any problem being a Zionist, how do you think there's a problem? It completely undermined the attacks on Zionism, and Brandeis knew that. He said, in the opinion of the president, there is no conflict between Zionism and loyalty to America. So that was the first crucial thing. Diaspora peoples, wherever they live in the modern period, are worried about their loyalty. If I can point to Louis Brandeis, I don't have anything to worry about. The second thing he does is he Americanizes Zionism. Now that means that American Zionism is going to be very different than European Zionism. That's the reason those of you who have gone through Professor Vital's multi-volume history of Zionism doesn't talk about America, because from his perspective, it wasn't Zionism at all what happened in America. It's something else that used the term. But basically, Brandeis created a Zionism for American Jews, and he defines it as an extension of Woodrow Wilson's dream. By battling for the Zionist cause, the American ideal of democracy, of social justice, of liberty will be given wider expression. And he directly links Americanism and Zionism in one of his most famous lines: to be good Americans, we must be better Jews, and to be better Jews, we must become Zionists. It would be unthinkable to find in European Zionism an equivalent. Yes, to be better Russians, we must be better Jews. What Jew would have signed on to such an idea? But in America, it's accepted. I'm not interested in whether it's logical. And his Zion really very much reflected his idea of what America should be. That's what's so amazing. He's taking progressive notions of America, many of which didn't get through Congress, and said, okay, we're going to build a model state on those ideas. The very word Commonwealth, you may have wondered, why have they called this but Commonwealth? Massachusetts is a Commonwealth. Pennsylvania is a Commonwealth. Why is it a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine? Where's that in the Torah? What is Commonwealth in Hebrew? And the answer is that's all about Brandeis. We're going to translate various ideas. And take a look at this too little known document, the last one that we haven't read, 1918. This is the other Pittsburgh program, not the Pittsburgh platform. Do not confuse them. They both took place in Pittsburgh. Jews like to have, a lot of people at conferences in Pittsburgh, because you could take a train from Chicago and you could take a train from New York, and they both ended up in Pittsburgh. And so lots of conferences were held there. And they hold a conference of American Zionism, probably the most important of all the conferences. In 1918, the newly reorganized Zionist Organization of America, and they put together these ideas. And this is the Zionism that American Jews are excited by and buy into. Very different than Jabotinsky Zionism or Ben-Gurion Zionism. This is Brandeis. We declare for political and civil equality, irrespective of race, sex, or faith of all the inhabitants of the land. Each of those terms important, and that's the very first thing they say. Second, to ensure in the Jewish national home in Palestine equality of opportunity, we favor a policy which, with due regard to existing rights, shall tend to establish the ownership and control by the whole people of the land of all natural resources, of all public utilities. Brandeis was a big believer that those were a public trust. Some of those ideas, those who remember deep in their American history will remember a man named Henry George, who was a big believer in everybody owning land. Henry George did not succeed in America, but those ideas are going to be realized, they thought, in Zion. And again, all land owned and controlled by the people shall be leased in such condition as will ensure the fullest opportunity for development and continuity of possession, and the cooperative principle in agriculture, industrial, commercial, financial undertakings. And then they talk about free public instruction, and they talk about Hebrew as the medium of expression. One of there is another draft which you sometimes see, which is even stronger. They're going to free the land from the evils of land, speculation, and every other form of financial oppression. I believe that Brandeis, who was a good politician, wanted a positive statement and axed those words, which were largely written by Horace Callan. But this is really, I once phrased it, that the Zion of their imagination reflected the America of their dreams. In other words, these were all the things progressives wanted to bring about in America, and now they think they're going to create them in Zion. And we see them in democracy in Zion, social justice in Zion, agrarianism. Brandeis was a big believer in the importance, like Jefferson, of working the land. Of course, that was an old Zionist idea and also an Enlightenment idea, and even smallness. Brandeis, who wrote a book called The Curse of Bigness, thought that smaller is better. And when he visits, he makes exactly, this is the greatest Zionist leader of the American Jewish community, he made exactly one trip to the land of Israel. He was sitting on the Supreme Court. He comes in 1919, and he writes to his wife, "It is a wonderful country, a wonderful city," meaning Jerusalem. Aronson, that's Aaron Aronson, is right. It is a miniature California, but a California endowed with all the interest which the history of man can contribute, and the deepest emotions which can stir a people. The ages long longing, the love is all explicable now. And then he concludes with an amazing line. It has also the great advantage over California of being small. So if you wondered whether Brandeis believed in the virtue of smallness, absolutely did. Now, I've spent a lot of time on Brandeis because it seems to me that we need to understand that and his utopian vision of Zion to contextualize the surprise, in some places the disappointment, in some American Jewish circles when Zionism went in very different direction. The Zionism of Brandeis is not the Zionism of Benjamin Netanyahu, of Menachem Begin. It really wasn't the Zionism of David Ben-Gurion or of Chaim Weitzman. They didn't quite know what to do with this Louis Brandeis. But that was the Zionism which excited American Jews for a long time. And it took a very long time for American Jews to figure out that what happened in the land of Israel was actually somewhat different than what Louis Brandeis imagined. I still remember the amazement of American Jews. What? Church and state are not separated? There's no First Amendment in Israel, and so on? And all of that goes back to the Brandeisian sense of Zion that a lot of American Jews had. Whether it's good that we diverged from Louis Brandeis, bad that it diverged from Louis Brandeis, that's for you to decide. But I hope there's now a better context, both for the American interest in Zion, how Jews become engaged in Zion, and then the beginnings of American Zionism itself. So I promised to give 10 minutes for questions. I keep that promise. Thanks very much for your attention. Yeah.
What's the argument or disagreement between Weitzman and Brandeis?
Again, the question is, what was the argument between Louis Brandeis and Weitzman? Again, there's a big literature on that, which suggests there are a lot of different theories. I give you mine, and that is there's a vast cultural difference. People at the time said this is the difference between a Jew who was raised in Eastern Europe, as Weitzman was later, and moves to London, and a Jew spent most of his time in Washington. Vast cultural difference, but there's something even more profound, which was my contribution. If you look at their attitudes towards money, you will see something quite important. Brandeis had a German Jewish sense that you had to conserve money. Money was something that you had to account for every nickel that is spent, and that you really had to watch over it. That nothing was more important to him. It's all over his letters, and it was very much his culture. Weitzman had an instrumental view of money. You took the money, you did something with it. You don't trust me that I'm honest? I don't want to give you accounts of every nickel. I'm using the money. Those of you who know this world know it's the difference between Yekkes and Hasidim, who also didn't get along very well. They're very, very different attitudes. And never should somebody who has one view of money marry someone who has the other. They will never live happily. They were so different. To Brandeis, it was just the beginning of wisdom, Aleph Bet, that you accounted, as he did his whole life, for every penny. He taught that to his children. It was basic to any movement he was part of. Every nickel is accounted for. To Weitzman, it was just ridiculous. And if you had to spend money you didn't have, the good Lord will provide. And you gave me money for this, but I know better. That's more important, and so on. And they're total, and that they just, at a very basic level, didn't trust one another, and that led to an inevitable breach, but in some respects it is the breach between Central European views and East European views. Good question. Yeah.
This was about the same time that Theodor Herzl was waking up to Zionism, although he was influenced by the Dreyfus affair. But did he have any American influence on his?
I think it's a very perceptive point, and I didn't much mention Herzl. I think that one can see in different places, for all the same reason, which is the outbreak of anti-Semitism, in new interest in Zionism. You see it in Eastern Europe, you see it in Central Europe, you see it in America. Now, yes, there were American Jews who, of course, fall under the tremendous charisma of Theodor Herzl, but there are very few American Jews who are at the various Zionist congresses. We go to the National Library, we have the protocols of each Zionist Congress. Interestingly, one of them was Rosa Sonnenschein, the editor of the American Jewess, one of the few women who's at the Zionist Congress, and there are others. But Brandeis never knew Herzl, and really comes to Zionism after Herzl. He reads Herzl. Emma Lazarus never goes to Europe. Well, she does go to Europe, but never to a Zionist Congress. She's in Europe earlier with her parents. So it's not easy to link them up. Herzl is deeply interested in America because Herzl is a good journalist, saw perfectly well that the center of Jewish gravity was shifting very rapidly to the New World. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are immigrating. And one of the people whom he does talk to is a very young, charismatic rabbi named Stephen Wise, who is a Zionist and who is that link. And there are letters from Herzl which make clear how interested he is in seeing Zionism happen in America. And there are a few books. There are two, one in Hebrew, a very good book by Friesel, Evitar Friesel, on early Zionism in America, and a less good book in English. But it's not a very important movement. Brandeis is infinitely more important than Herzl on the ground in what he does, and Herzl himself never comes to America. Yeah, good. Other, yeah.
Did Herzl,
Brandeis
envision moving the European Jews to Israel, or did he want the American Jews?
No, he didn't. It's a very good question. You know, the old joke, which was, I think, not far wrong, about American Zionism was it was a movement of one Jew to give money to another Jew to send a third Jew to Palestine. I think most of them, not all, most of the American Zionists imagined that you needed this movement for persecuted European Jews who had nowhere to go and who couldn't come to America. That's why I said, if America had said, we agree with the Reformed Jews, we're the new Zion, let all who hunger come, the whole history of the 20th century Jewish community would be different. Brandeis himself, we certainly know, had no intention, because Weitzman invites him to become head of the Zionist movement, but then he's got to leave the Supreme Court and move, and he doesn't. And he never goes again after his one visit. Most of the American Jews, even Hadassah, doesn't talk much about Aliyah. They talk about a place for other people, and Henrietta Zold comes, but she's more a missionary. The way Protestants went to Africa, she goes to the Middle East and is viewed by Americans as a kind of missionary, helping the benighted poor of this backward land move up the ladder. But the people, who came to America thought they'd won the lottery. And they're very small, not that they're so big today, but very, very small numbers. I haven't done the math, but if I had to guess, more Jews go back to Russia after 1917 because the communist revolution and utopia, and we're going to build the new Russia. It didn't end well, in case you hadn't heard. More, I think, go back to Russia than go to Palestine. In the 30s, in the Depression, it's more, and partly that's because the Depression, the Depression doesn't hit Eretz Yisrael. A lot of German Jews have come, escaping Hitler. They've been able to bring money because of the Ha'avara, the transfer agreement. There's new population. That's good for the economy here. And there are people who come from America to Israel at that time. But it's not a big, it's not a big coming. And most American Zionists did not believe that Zion. That's why Vital won't include American Zionism as Zionist. A good Zionist means everybody goes. American Zionists thought other people should go, but that to some extent is accurate. I think in terms of that. Anybody else? The last? Yeah, last question. Yeah.
You said in the 1870s there's a growth of Jew hatred, etc. Well, what brought it about?
And really, I think we can better understand it now that we've seen it in our own time. There are moments when countries kind of pivot. And what happens, first of all, you've had a change of administration. The Republican, what's happened is that you had something called the Compromise of 1877, and that meant all the troops were removed from the South, and immediately the South brings in the Jim Crow legislation. You have had economic decline, and there's a quite substantial move against foreigners, a sense we are not able to assimilate all of these newcomers, better to keep them out. And you're going to see a parade of restrictive legislation beginning in the 1880s and ending 40 years later. So America, it's a move from optimism to pessimism, from liberalism to conservatism, and there are a lot of other reasons within the Jewish world as well. But there's a real change of mood in America and in Jewish life in the 1870s, and young Jews picked it up at once. They had felt, we're moving towards utopia here, getting better and better. America accepts everything, and then it doesn't. Within Jewish life, there's also a certain fear of assimilation. That's another issue with some examples of intermarriage and so on. But a lot of things come together to suggest to young American Jews it's time for a big change. And change comes with young Jews. We're seeing change. Maybe we don't like the change today, but young Jews today, I think, are changing some of the norms of American Jewish life. In the late 19th century, that was a kind of religious awakening that had enormous implications, also cultural implications. And those young Jews, which included people like Cyrus Adler and Henrietta Zold, are going to lead American Jewish life through World War II. So it's a hugely important movement. On that happy note, maybe there can be revitalization. You never give up. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.